Now, I've been a fan of Hillsdale long before I ever stepped foot in Washington, D.C., so I'm here in my personal capacity, and what I'm going to tell you, I've written about it before, but it's not President Trump's position, the administration's position, or the position of my office. Now, if you wanted to learn economics from one episode, the pandemic might be one. I think there was a book written to that effect. But the 2010 Affordable Care Act is what one side of the aisle calls it. Obamacare is what another side of the aisle calls it. It also can be a full economics lesson in one policy. We learn a lot from it, about the role of the government in the economy. And it's been going for 15 years, so we're having more and more evidence about how that's going. Now, we shouldn't be surprised if you know a little bit about the role of government in the economy in practice, again, not in theory. We shouldn't be surprised that it promised one thing, better health and economic performance, but delivered neither. Now, to be fair, the Affordable Care Act was motivated by real problems in healthcare financing, such as uncompensated care and the difficulty of keeping insurance coverage in between jobs. But in tackling those narrow issues, it created far bigger ones, and we'll see, for workers, for employers, and taxpayers. Now, there was a big expansion of Obamacare at the end of the pandemic, which wasn't that long ago. But before that, for several years, we had more or less a steady state participation in Obamacare marketplace plans, and it was about 4% of the population, actually less than 4% of the population. That's small, right? 4% of the population, and there's 96% of the population that was not on Obamacare plans. Nonetheless, that sliver of 4% has been driving the federal health care agenda. As I address you today, a record government shutdown has the entire US government being held hostage on behalf of that quite small minority. Now, before we go any further, I need to issue what I call in my classes a homonym alert. So let me tell a story about my youngest son. He was about 7 years old at the time. He and his older brothers, they won free Big Macs at an NBA game. And this son, he was super excited about his free Big Mac. Disproportionately ecstatic about that free Big Mac. And the next day, I gave the oldest son the vouchers, and I sent them all into McDonald's to claim their prizes, their Big Macs. So the cashier, she handed that bag of Big Macs over to my oldest son. Looking perturbed, the youngest son says, "Let me see that bag." So he looks inside. "Where's my Apple computer?" There'll be a few people here who'll catch on to that in about 5 minutes. It'll be part of the fun. Well, there's a big homonym scam in the health area. Or maybe to be accurate, I like to be 100% accurate. Let's call it a near homonym scam. Because you have three things. Health, that's one. You got healthcare, and you got health insurance. And these three are not the same. Not even close. You can have one without the other, two without the third. So Senator Bernie Sanders, you've probably heard him, he loved to say, "We are the only major country on earth that does not guarantee health care to all people." He doesn't mean health or health care. He says health care, but he doesn't mean health or health care. He means health insurance. That's the homonym trick, which was funny when it happened to the 7-year-old, but not so funny when it happens to a whole country. Now, Republicans understood this, but they perennially failed to shift attention in Washington away from insurance and toward health, those two very different things. And we owe Health Secretary Kennedy a big debt of success in this area. He's got Washington talking about chronic disease, which a large majority of Americans have. For every American on an Obamacare plan, there's 10 or 20 with at least one chronic disease. Indeed, Obamacare contributed to chronic disease because really Washington, I should say government, can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Now, when I put it that way, it sounds humorous, but this is true throughout the history of government. They get fixated, at best they can fixate on some objective, a single objective, and have people focus on it and maybe achieve it. Maybe it's Stalin building some massive canal. Meanwhile, people can't eat. That's the nature of government. You don't expect it to be juggling a lot of balls and do it well. And the Obama administration was not immune from that. It talked incessantly about expanding health insurance and advertised that that expansion would save lives, particularly among non-elderly people. We already have Medicare, and we had Medicare for my entire lifetime for elderly people, so Obamacare is something for the non-elderly. But as they fixated on expanding that health insurance, they lost sight of health, they lost sight of chronic disease, particularly the raging opioid epidemic. Remember, we're talking about 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. Look at this chart. 2014, when we first got the health insurance that was promised. The law was passed in 2010, 3 years of buildup. We started having health insurance under Obamacare in 2014. After increasing an average of 1.5 years per decade before 2014, you can see some of that in the chart. I could take that going back even before World War II. We had 2014 when we're going to be saving the lives we were promised, and life expectancy declined. 1 year, a second year, a third year, totally unheard of. 2 years, let alone 3 years in a row, to see a decline like that. Now, this is not saying that having an Obamacare card in your pocket is fatal. I don't think it is. It's really back to the walking and chewing gum problem. When you're fixated on rolling out these insurance, remember the websites that didn't work? We were all talking about that, and everyone in a government authority was focused on that. But another part of what was going on was opioid prescriptions were being paid for with government insurance and not necessarily used by the person with the prescription. So on the heels, and furthermore, on the heels of that flood of insurance-funded prescriptions, illicit fentanyl further elevated mortality rates among young people. And again, the Obama administration had no clue that was happening. So that's the health side of Obamacare, and we have broken promises around that. I think economics leads us to understand and expect such broken promises. Now let's look at, let's call it the deficit. Obamacare, and I'm quoting the Obama administration. You can see it on Obama White House archives.gov. It would be deficit reducing healthcare reform that would be saving over $200 billion over 10 years and more than $1 trillion in the second decade. Okay, well, how is that going to happen? Well, a bunch of revenue sources were going to be implemented, we were promised, bringing revenue to help pay for that. A big one was nationalization of student lending. They don't know about that here at Hillsdale because you don't use federal loans to come here. But there's an awful lot of federal loans for college and university, government funded. They were run by banks. Surprise, surprise, a bank running a lending system. They know how to do that. But in Obamacare, the government took that over. And this was the idea for that. Now, how do you get revenue? Just by shifting a business from private sector into the government. Well, the idea for that, thoroughly Marxist, discredited, I would say, Marxist claim, but recycled nonetheless, is that what banks charge is unnecessary and exploitive. Banks aren't on the factory floor, Marx said, so they don't deserve anything. And so the idea was, well, putting the government in charge of the loans would mean easy money for the US Treasury. You're laughing, but the Congressional Budget Office, let me remind you, that's the government supposedly nonpartisan scorekeeper for the budget. They proved gullible on this. They scored Obamacare as bringing in various sorts of revenue that I'm going to show you, including revenue from its student loan business. But as we know, you're laughing now because many of you heard that the reality was the opposite, overwhelmingly the opposite. The federal government incurred massive, massive losses on its student loan business, if we want to call it that. Also adding to the deficit, more on the spending side, is waste, fraud, and abuse in marketplace plans. This became particularly acute when the subsidies expanded just a few years ago. I'm going to just use Paragon Health Institute's words because I think they sum it up well. They said the Biden administration prioritized prioritized enrollment over program integrity. We want enrollment, integrity not so much, and permitted a Wild West atmosphere with rampant amounts of unauthorized enrollments and unauthorized plan switching, close quote. So this year, here we are in 2025, as much as 26% of marketplace participants are improperly enrolled, meaning according to the law that's in our US code, even after Biden got to change it, 26% of the people are not eligible to be getting what they're getting. Other purported deficit reducers were the health insurance tax. That was going to bring in revenue. We were going to get revenue from the Cadillac tax. Cadillac tax was also going to reduce healthcare costs and therefore government spending. The medical device tax, that was going to bring in revenue. The individual mandate tax, all those were repealed. Now there's one more tax that does remain, and let's give it some attention. It's called the employer mandate. The mandate part is a requirement, of course, that employers of a certain size, they either need to provide health insurance for their full-time employees or pay a penalty for not doing so. And there was a Supreme Court case of are penalties taxes? I'm not a lawyer, so when I say penalty, I say tax. I mean the same thing. The Congressional Budget Office, again, they scored it back in 2009 when the law was being debated. They scored it as, well, yeah, there's going to be some revenue coming in from the employer mandate penalty part of it. And then again in 2017, when we were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, this congressional budget scored it, and they said, well, you're going to have to kiss some revenue goodbye. But there's no revenue from the employer mandate. We know that now. That's figure 2 that I brought with me. We had trouble getting this data. Swamp doesn't want us to know, but we eventually got data for 2016 and 2017. The blue bar is what the Congressional Budget Office projected. roughly $10 billion a year coming from the employer mandate. The orange bar, which is so tiny, you might need a telescope or binoculars to see it, that's the penalty amount that the IRS assessed. And then just because the IRS assesses doesn't mean they get it. And so that's the little, even more sliver, the blue sliver, that's what the IRS collected. So to a very good approximation, if we use the CBO's projections as a standard for measuring things, we got no revenue from the employer mandate. Like many parts of Obamacare, it seemed like a good idea on paper, but it collapses in practice once incentives and enforcement costs come into play. Now, I want to talk a little more about this penalty because it wasn't always understood that we weren't going to get revenue from that penalty. So how does the penalty work? Well, it applies to full-time employees. If an employer is not offering coverage, they're going to pay the penalty with an exception I'll mention. They're going to pay the penalty on their full-time employees. So if they want to cut back on their penalty payments, cut back on their full-time employees. And of course, there's two ways to do that. You can change full-time employees into part-time employees, and I'll give you an example of that. Or you can have them not work at all, and I'll give you an example of that. The dollar amount of this penalty doesn't depend on, and didn't depend on, whether your employee is rich or poor or middle class. All it matters is that they were working full-time. So naturally, if you're going to try to raise revenue with a tax that falls on full-time employment and no other criteria, then you're going to get less full-time employment. What are you going to get instead of full-time employment? Well, maybe you'll get more part-time employment. And we've seen that a lot in the data. An example from where I'm from in Chicago, the Chicago Cubs did that. They had a full-time grounds crew and they switched to a part-time grounds crew. And then we had a day when there was some weather. The fans were there, they had some weather, and the part-timers weren't there yet. And they couldn't handle, the Cubs couldn't handle the weather situation on the ground and ruin the game. This is just one example how these policies ripple through to the economy. When they wrote Obamacare, they didn't intend to ruin a Cubs game, but that's what happened. Now, the other thing that can happen, I oversimplified a little. A company can cut its payment, yes, by cutting its full-time employment, but another way it can do it is keeping its business small, and of course, small being defined the way Obamacare would define small, and did define small. That took several hundred pages in the Federal Register to get that straightened out, but today let's say, if you kept your company below 50 employees, then you would not have a penalty, no matter how many, whether you had full-time, part-time, whether you offered insurance or not. So what happened is 49 became an artificially magic number for employers. As soon as that new part of the law went into effect, there was a surge in the fraction of employers who would remain 49 or so. So that's my third chart. We can see once the IRS began to think about and arrange for assessing this penalty, we see a surge in the number of the fraction of small employers being less than 100. Of all employers with 100 or fewer, how many were 49 or fewer? That's what we're seeing in the chart, and we see this spike. Then it fades over time, and the reason it fades over time was figure 2. We started to realize, look, they're not going to be collecting this penalty. So then those companies who were trying hard to stay under 50, they realized, well, we don't need to do that anymore. We misunderstood. We believed the Congressional Budget Office and everyone else who said this was going to be a real tax. Okay, so those are some of the broken promises around revenue. Now I want to look at some of the promises around the economy, and there were promises made about the economy there. And for that, I want to look at the subsidies, and I guess it's lucky in a sense, in current event sense, because the subsidies are exactly what's being debated right now about during the shutdown. Should we have even more subsidies than were in the Obamacare law as it was passed? So think for a second, this is not how Obamacare works, but think for a second that people were paying full price for their health insurance. It's a fairly simple concept. What that means, you pay the full price. It doesn't mean that the insurer will look at your tax return to decide how much you pay. No, when there's a full price, there's a full price, and that's what people pay. We could even imagine a discount on the full price, maybe a 30% discount for everybody. Again, that would not involve looking at your tax return or looking at your employment situation. And so, as an economist, I would never call either of those schemes a tax on employment or a tax on income, because they don't depend on your income. The people who work pay the same as the people who don't work. The people who earn a lot pay the same as people who don't earn a lot. But that's not how Obamacare was written, and it's not how it's implemented today. Particularly, the discount, or the subsidy, if you want to call it that, is tied to the employment situation. It's not really tied to the income. There is an element of that, but it's tied to your employment situation. If you have a full-time job that offers coverage on that job, and the vast majority of people with full-time jobs, their employer does offer coverage. So if you are that type of person, you don't get the subsidy. End of the story. Doesn't matter if you're poor or rich, you're not getting the subsidy because you have a full-time job. If you want that subsidy, for whatever reason, you want that subsidy, you need to get out of the full-time job. Again, could be part-time, could be not working at all. So the subsidies are a backdoor tax on full-time employment. Now, no politician ever calls that a tax, but when you're in a group of people who doesn't get a subsidy, when everyone else does, that's a tax on being in your group. And the group we're talking about here is full-time workers. Now, CBO largely missed this too. This is the third thing they messed up. And that's not an exhaustive list. They missed this too when they scored the effective law in the economy, and they forgot to recognize that the subsidy is a tax on full-time work. They did, on this third point, they did correct themselves after the law was passed, but they did correct. Now, since then, the power of this tax has grown a lot because the subsidies have grown a lot. Obamacare is broken in a number of other ways that I won't have time to talk about. That grew the subsidy, and then we had, during the pandemic, a big expansion in the subsidies. It's especially now encouraging early retirement. I guess being the age that I am, I'm especially shocked by that because, from my vantage point at least, the middle-aged workers are the ones with lots of wisdom and lots to offer the workplace. But you know who that's coming from. But these subsidies are pushing out the early retirees to be retirees. And we're losing whatever that is they were offering. I think it's a lot. We're losing that in our labor market. That happened famously in Chicago. Our mayor put the public employees who are early retirees, put them on Obamacare. Our mayor was involved with passing Obamacare, our mayor at the time, so he did this immediately as soon as it was possible. But other public sector entities, states, localities, municipalities are increasingly doing this. New Jersey has been in the spotlight recently. More and more early retirees coming out of New Jersey, state government, let's say, and going into Obamacare. And this saves New Jersey a lot of money. So you can guess who's a fan of these big subsidies right now. These blue states and cities that I'm talking about. Because it's paying for health insurance that they would be paying for otherwise if the federal program wasn't doing it. Okay, so if you tax full-time employment, and this is a backdoor tax of full-time employment, you're going to get less full-time employment. The other thing you're going to get, because there are some loopholes, and we talked about the part-time loophole, the 49 loophole, you have some loopholes, you're going to get a shift in business practices that sacrifices productivity in order to utilize the loopholes. Maybe your company's better to be a 55-person company rather than a 49, but you pick 49 in order to take advantage of the loophole, which has essentially cash attached to it. So that's going to reduce productivity. You have these two effects: less full-time employment and less productivity of those who remain in full-time employment. So 5 years ago, that would be in 2020, I released a study with Kevin Hassett, Tim Fitzgerald, and Cody Collin of the economic effects of candidate Biden's agenda compared to President Trump's. And of course, Biden was a candidate then. He was making promises, and you're wondering, well, is he going to do all these programs he's going to talk about? And we had several scenarios and say, look, if Biden ends up picking this menu of policies, here's what will happen to the economy. And one of the things on our menu was essentially a combination of expanded Obamacare and a Green New Deal. And that's what Biden ended up doing. So we have published in 2020 a forecast for the Biden economy based on his policies that he ended up doing. Now, were we right about our forecasts? We dismal scientists were saying, hey, if you tax full-time employment, you're going to get less full-time employment, you're going to get less productivity. Well, we projected in 2020, and it was a projection going forward 4 or 5 years. We said, well, we're going to have 5.0 less per capita income from work, adjusted for inflation, of course, so less real income from work, 5.0%. At the time, I wondered, should I have that decimal place? Maybe that's a little bit presumptuous, but we went with a 1 decimal place. Furthermore, we said about half of that was going to come from less employment, and the other half from less productivity, lower real wages, in other words. That was our projection. Now, there have been a lot of, and there still are, a lot of cheerleaders for Obamacare and Bidenomics in my profession. None of them stood up to offer their own quantitative prediction. They were ready to say that we were wrong. Remember, this is 2020. Ready to say that they were wrong, but they didn't really have a projection of what they thought would happen under the Biden economy, except it was going to be awesome, of course. So what we did, here's my fourth figure that we prepared this time last year. We were 4 years out from our prediction. The Biden first term was coming to an end. And we thought, oh, that's a good time to check. We made predictions with 1 decimal point even. We made predictions. Maybe we ought to look at how it's coming out. So this is, again, what I talked about, inflation-adjusted employee compensation per adult. It's an index, so 100 is normalized. That's the beginning. The first quarter of 2017 is 100. And then everything beyond that would be, you can interpret as a percentage increase above where it was in 2017. Now, we don't know for sure what would have happened if President Trump had begun a second term in 2021. Many of us dreamed about that, but it didn't happen. But the chart shows a linear trend fit to the first Trump term. So we'd say, well, maybe that's what would have happened if President Trump had continued, the trend would have continued. Now we had a pandemic, bounce back from that, go back to the trend. Actually, it's not a bad model for early 2021. The depth of the pandemic, remember, was mid-2020. We were bouncing back to that trend pretty quickly, held that trend, right around that trend for a bit there. But then Biden's policies start to kick in, I would say. Certainly inflation hit, and employee compensation and national income were not able to keep up. That's why we begin to see the anti-growth effects. I think of Biden's policies, of something in that orange, yellowish orange line beginning in late 2021. By the end of the data that we had last year when we were checking our prediction, the real per capita income for work, which we promised to be 5.0% below trend, was in fact 4.6% below trend. Now, we did say it would be 50-50, 2.5 from those two aspects of real compensation per worker. One is the wage, real wage, and the other is the number of workers. Turned out it wasn't 50-50, it was more like 75-25. But I think we did pretty well. And number one, using economics up front and saying, let's not be surprised about what happens, and then checking to see how it played out. There's always room to learn when you make a prediction and you look back. So there's a bunch of economics of Obamacare, but maybe the best way to remember it, let's remember my son, the 7-year-old son. When he opened that bag, he looked and he said, "Where's my Apple computer?" He got an early lesson in the value of skepticism. Obamacare appeared to offer health and prosperity, and now 15 years later, today, we're being told that any disruption is worth preserving that Obamacare that's promising health and prosperity. But when we check the bag, it's hardly anything more than a sack of broken promises. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulligan. We now have time for questions. If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Isn't this whole mess a plot to get us on Medicare, the whole country on Medicare? Medicare for all.
Well, that's another homonym alert. Medicare for all actually shuts down all Medicare that we have. There's no private insurance allowed in Medicare for all. According to the bill's not passed, but if it were passed, it would be illegal to have private health insurance through an employer, through a health insurance company, whereas most Medicare is in fact private. So that's a homonym alert on the back end of a homonym alert. But I would agree with the sentiment, which is the idea is to accumulate power. Again, that's not a lesson of government that we're learning for the first time in the United States in the early 21st century. Accumulate power, so we grab more of the healthcare sector for the government, and that's be a path to another grab for more power. So I think that a lot of people imagine it playing out that way, both supporters and detractors.
I appreciate your talk. I appreciate your economic take on everything that you talked about. I'm curious to hear what you'd think would happen if we privatized, or at least got rid of the employer healthcare mandate. Like, would that make health insurance cheaper? What would make health insurance cheaper? And people like to talk about like the inequitable income or the inequitable effects of making healthcare not like mandated. Is that something that would? Are their claims founded?
Now, you mentioned a few things. Now, the employer mandate is doing nothing now except causing lawyers and consultants some activity because it's not bringing in revenue. I think a lot of employers understand now that if they don't offer health coverage, they're not going to have to pay for not doing that. And they've understood from the beginning. I know I did a survey of them early on. They understood from the beginning that their employees may like it that they don't offer coverage, because remember when I mentioned about the subsidies, if you're working at a company that's offering coverage, you don't get the subsidies. So there's that pull. How expensive is health insurance? Depends on the type of health insurance. Now, there's the Obamacare plans, again, which is somewhere around 4%, maybe these days it's 5 or 6% of the population. It's very, very expensive, very heavily regulated. Regulated both in terms of what it must cover, also a lot of the economics of it very much encourages lots of spending by the plan. Even if the members of the plan don't value it that much, it's incentivized to do that. It makes it hard, particularly in some counties, for insurers to get in the business, so there's not a lot of competition. So I think, I'm quite confident there are fixes to Obamacare, and maybe that fix is getting rid of it, but other fixes as well that would make it work more like a market and it would make the Obamacare plans cheaper. Now, our other plans that the 96% of people, or probably 94% of people, are on some kind of other plan, making those cheaper, again, getting rid of Obamacare would help. They have some Obamacare rules they have to obey. But I would guess the progress toward making health insurance cheaper for the 94% wouldn't be huge, because I'm not sure Obamacare is that huge. There are a bunch of other regulations. In fact, that's how I got in the current position that I'm in. There's so much regulation going on in Washington, and so much of it around health care. It's a massively regulated sector. Sometimes in my class I like to ask, who set more prices? The Dr. Oz, who runs the federal health insurance plans, or the Politburo in the Soviet Union? The answer is Dr. Oz. Now, he stuck with the laws that were in place when he got there, so I'm not blaming Dr. Oz. But there's a massive amount of government regulation in all kinds of health insurance. So that would be a big thing that I would look at, aside from Obamacare. Good questions.
Question to the speaker's right.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us, Dr. Mulligan. I'm aware that certain countries like Israel have a thriving economy, yet at the same time they have universal basic health care. My question is, what policies do you recommend that we institute so that we have a temporary health safety net for those who need it, while at the same time not destroying our economy?
Okay, I need to follow, because I'm trying to keep my homonyms straight. There's health care, and there's health insurance. Israel's a long way away from here. I love the country. I recommend anyone you get a chance to go. It's a wonderful country, wonderful people. They have a different lifestyle than us. That's one of the big determinants of health. Very big determinant. When I showed the graph of life expectancy, I think all sides agree that personal behavior was turning that curve. And the opioid epidemic is. Now, there's addiction and things like that. I'm not saying it's easy to be in that situation, but this is more around personal behavior and not around health insurance directly. Now, health insurance has indirect effects in terms of encouraging certain types of behavior rather than others. So when I look at Israeli health, or health, you name the country, I want to understand their personal behavior situation. I think a better comparison would be the United Kingdom. They have a lot of the personal behavior. You hear my Irish name, Scottish names, things like that. There's a lot of similarities between how people live in England, Scotland, Ireland, and the way people live here. And not Ireland, but the United Kingdom has a national health service. And it has massive, massive problems in getting health care, which is not health and it's not health insurance. So in the UK, everyone has health insurance. Bernie Sanders told us that. But not everybody has health care. There's a big line for, you name it. You're going to wait in line for it in the United Kingdom. The economy in the United Kingdom is also not so much in Ireland. In fact, Ireland's growing massively right now. But in the United Kingdom, very bad economic performance. And the government is a big factor on that. Heavy taxes, heavy regulation, Now, is all that from healthcare? It'd be interesting to break down how much of the heavy government burden in the United Kingdom comes from its healthcare obligations versus other obligations. But I think that would be a worthwhile comparison.
Thank you, sir, for taking your time to come speak with us. I'm very concerned about the national debt, and particularly the interest on the national debt that occupies a large portion of our federal budget every year. Do you have any number in your head about how much spending we would save annually if you were just to utterly cut federal Medicare or Obamacare? And is that in any way realistic outcome?
Well, I'm not a politician. I can't get 4 votes in a faculty meeting. Maybe if I came here, I could get 6 votes on the faculty here. I don't know. So the political predictions are tough for me to engage in. You know, the president's budget, President Trump had a budget in the first term, 4 of them that I participated in a lot, and he's put out, I think, 1 budget now. It's a pretty good place to look to in terms of what we might aspire to in cutting back various programs. And I know all presidents take their budget very seriously. Now the Congress ends up setting the spending levels, and they don't match the president's budget a lot. So there's definitely room there. There's one thing that we did, I mentioned how Medicare is, you might say, half private on the insurance side of things. It hasn't always been that way. Republicans introduced kind of a dual track system with a private option. They call it Medicare Advantage. And then the more government insurance option, which is called traditional Medicare. And we allow our senior citizens to pick which one they want. And the private option's been winning in the sense of getting seniors to choose that rather than the other one. It ended up saving money in the sense we spend lots of money, so maybe you don't want to call it saving, but compared to what CBO projected, when we created those programs, CBO had projections, how's that going to play out? And they thought that that private option would end up costing a lot more than it really did. I think they underappreciated, I'm of the firm opinion, CBO underappreciates the market pressures that come with a competitive system. And so, in fact, those are the only instances I know of a government program coming in under cost. Now, it wasn't cheap, and don't ask me to pay for those programs, but they came in a lot less than CBO thought they would cost. Yeah, good questions.
What has been the history of cost per patient over the past 12 or 15 years with Obamacare? And would costs be saved a lot by having transparent convertibility or transferability of these plans that I've heard people talk about?
Now, by patient, you mean per person enrolled. Yeah, that's gone up a lot. The patient is an interesting question because we're not sure how many patients there are. There's a lot of people on Obamacare that don't know they're on Obamacare. And it's part of the crooked system. Particularly, again, since it got expanded, there's been incentive for bureaucrats and middlemen to put people on Obamacare who don't even know it, and they get a commission and so on. But the cost per enrollee has gone up more than double since 2014, and the cost per patient even more so because there aren't as many patients as we think. Now the transferability, it always depends on the details. Transferability may sound good on paper. How you can implement it, we always want to check the details. Because what sounds good on paper but has poor details, it'll end up with very disappointing results. Yeah, good questions.
Over here, to your right.
Hello.
The third-party payer model has completely broken economic incentives. So 2 thoughts. Can we ever get to where we treat health insurance like we do auto insurance, where auto insurance covers major catastrophe and we use out-of-pocket expense to change our oil? change that to healthcare. Health insurance covers major expenses, and everyday annual health care is done with our own dollar. And second, you alluded to personal responsibility. Is there ever going to be a politician with the courage to say that and still get elected?
Maybe Bobby Kennedy, I don't know. Now, the type of insurance that you described, just covering the big bills and leaving everything else uncovered, Obamacare really made that hard. There is a bit of a window for that, and there are some people today that have such policies, but they're heavily disadvantaged in the marketplace by regulation. So certainly if you were to remove those regulations, I know in the first Trump administration we looked at that and made some progress toward that, maybe got undone in the middle 4 years, you would have more and more people on that. Also know a lot of doctors, internal medicine, general practitioners who dealing with their patients that way. They have a membership fee. It doesn't even come from insurance. So I could see that as being a viable product. I think economists overestimate how prevalent that would be. But again, I would rather let the market play it out, and maybe I'll be wrong. I think there are people who are willing to pay extra in order to have first dollar coverage. And those people are people too, and they get to make choices with their own money, and they may end up choosing that. I think the other thing that you have is the group purchasing element. And so when an insurance company's dollars on the line, they're incentivized to work deals with hospitals and practices and things like that, pharmacies. So there may be people choosing it for that reason. But again, I'm projecting how the market would play out. I think the spirit of your comment that I would fully agree with was, let's get out of the way of that being a product. And if it's a great product, it would succeed. If it's not a great product, it wouldn't. But it should survive on its merits, not on legal protections.
Thank you for your talk. I was curious, what would you say were the incentives, goals, aspirations of the elected officials instituting Obamacare?
Well, again, I'm not a politician. I get the 4 votes in the faculty meeting, but I do know some of the facts. It was passed entirely on party lines. So whatever incentives must have been somehow related to party. The basic issues that I mentioned in the beginning, uncompensated care, the difficulty getting coverage in between jobs, that was not a uniparty sort of thing. There were a variety of people recognized those problems, a variety, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, all had ideas on how to deal with those issues. So there was a wide recognition that those were the issues. But Obamacare, the people who wrote it and the people who voted for it were quite a select group there. So I'm not sure I know much of an answer to that other than to point to some of the data that would have to inform such an answer.
Question to the speaker's right.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. And my question is, similar to what he said about the third-party system. It's one of the only products that you buy that you have no idea what it's going to cost you when you're finally done with the whole thing. And is there any way that in the works or brainstorming about how to be able to find out how much, so you can do price comparisons between different coverages and not the insurance coverages, but treatment options and that kind of thing, so you can see what you're getting.
Well, there are a lot of proposals in states and also at the federal level, and we have some implemented. They use the word price transparency. Maybe when you put it that way, it sounds good. Another way you could put it, which would be just as accurate but sound very different, is mandatory disclosure, because that's a mandate. There's been mixed success, I think, because maybe price transparency has some things going for it, but it's a mandate. And companies do things like anybody. They do things to adjust to try to make the mandate less applicable to them or less onerous on them. So I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that some of the early federal price transparency laws that were passed under that motivation have been disappointing to the people who voted for them and advocated for them. Maybe there's price transparency, the sequel that will be better and get it right. I don't know, we'll see.
What lessons should our policymakers learn from comparing the projections and the actuals since the implementation of Obamacare? What should they take away from this?
Well, not being able to walk and chew gum. Is it the policymakers or the voters? In the end of the day, I think it comes down to us citizens. I mean, that's why the Hillsdale training is so important. I mean, Hillsdale's not a public policy school, right? We're not training bureaucrats. There may be some people who graduate here, become a bureaucrat or a politician. Great. But the citizenry in general needs to be well trained. And I would like the citizenry to understand the walk and chew gum problem, that an organization where you have to have all kind of agreement is not going to have a lot of capability. And we've seen that in history. Even somebody mentioned Israel. Israel's fascinating for its kibbutz. There's a book I recommend, The Miracle of the Kibbutz, I think. It's an economics book about kibbutz. Kibbutzim have been around for, 75 years, maybe longer. And initially they started out as socialist systems on a very small scale. So maybe that's a scale where socialism can work. Start on a very small scale. Marxist kind of philosophy. No managers, no capital. Everybody's a worker. Now you got to be a boss too. Somebody has to be a boss. Well, everybody was the boss. So it was a political system. Decisions were made on the kibbutzim. Back then they were largely farms. Even today a lot of them are farms. Everything by vote. And one thing that the kibbutzim learned is, boy, we get a lot of bad decisions when we vote on stuff. Instead of having a boss who's invested, can be fired for making a bad decision. And there was a major bankruptcy across the kibbutzim. Hundreds of kibbutzim went bankrupt. And maybe the number one reason is they were making decisions through the political process rather than more free actors. So I think that would be the number one lesson. It's a lesson of Obamacare. It's a lesson of the kibbutzim. Probably it's a lesson we'll relearn again. There's probably a number two, but I think number one goes pretty far. Decisions that are done individually could be literally one person making a decision or different groups, different companies, different schools. It's great we have lots of colleges, right? Some can do one model, others can do another model. It's a lot better to have decisions made in a decentralized way than a centralized way. Now, sometimes you need to do it to fight a war or whatever. But really the lesson is, remember how bad the decisions are and really limit the kind of choices you want to put into the big government machine, because you won't be impressed by what comes out. And if it's your only choice, that's what you got to do. But for a lot of things, a lot of industries, a lot of products, a lot of services, we don't need to put it through the big government machine. We can let it be handled in a less centralized way. Yeah, good questions.
We now have time for one final question.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to Hillsdale. Jeff definitely enjoyed listening to your talk here. I was wondering, do you think Obamacare has increased the incentive for medical service providers to increase the price of their services?
Yeah, it had a few design issues with it. One's a lack of competition in insurance in some counties. And so then it makes the insurance cost a lot because the insurer doesn't have a competitor. And then you have really a price control in the insurance. And it's based on how much they pay the providers. So, in fact, if an insurance company wants to earn more profit on their policies, they can achieve that by paying the providers more. It's a rather weird situation, and so the insurers have become less of a discipline on provider payments because they've kind of been partners in inflating that.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Mulligan.